Hello, everyone, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caress Schenk from Nazarbayev University in Astana. And Caress, can you introduce yourself, please, for our students?
Yes, thank you, Irina, for having me on this interview, and hello to all of the students in Birmingham or wherever you may be physically located in these strange pandemic online study times. So yes, I'm Caress Schenk. I am an associate professor of political science at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. So I'm American, but I moved to Kazakhstan 9 years ago, partly because it was a job, right? And jobs are good, and you go where the jobs go. But also because my research area is Russia and Eurasian politics. And for me, it's been a great opportunity to live and work in the region that I study.
Great, thank you. And Caress recently published a book with a very provocative title, Why Control Immigration?
Yeah. I happen to have a copy here, so I'll show you.
So, Caress, sorry for me to be so blunt, but why should we control, or why should the state control immigration?
Right. Well, this is a great question. And I think since I'm a political scientist, for me, the answer is always political. And politics, in kind of a very general definition, is just about who gets what, how, and why, and who gets to make decisions about the distribution of resources. So, I mean, we can certainly ask why control immigration in a sort of normative way, right? Why should states control immigration? And you might actually get a different answer than if you ask the question of why do states control immigration? So if you ask the question in a normative sense, like how should states or countries control immigration, you'll probably get a lot of things that are steeped in certain moral frameworks or partisan politics or something like this. You might get some people that say, well, we actually shouldn't control immigration because it violates human rights, or we shouldn't control immigration because we want the free exchange of labor, or we should control immigration because of all of the reasons that people that think that that they believe, including things like, well, we should control immigration because it takes jobs away from Native people and all of those sorts of things. But like I said, I think that when you ask the question of why do states control immigration, it's always a story about politics. It's a story about decision makers trying to balance different needs among the population and among the different groups in their population. And inevitably, when you have a country that has large immigration flows, you have people that want immigration and free access to immigration, and you have another part of the population that doesn't want immigration. And the very difficult task of policymakers is to try to make both of those sets of people happy, and to try to convince people that that particular politician or that particular party is going to make good decisions about immigration. And so in that sense, the task of a policymaker is very difficult, right? Because it's difficult to please everybody, and it's difficult to actually make policies that do what you promise that they're going to do. So in many ways, what we see, I think, in the world is that politicians make decisions about controlling immigration based on what kind of political gains they can get from these decisions, how well it actually convinces people or gets people to approve of the type of job that you're doing. So shortly, that's why it's all political.
Thank you. And why do you think the Russian case is special, but also what are the main political gains of Russian government in terms of controlling immigration, and who are the main agents of this control in Russia?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, Russia's definitely different, right? So my book focuses on Russia, but in the end, I try to kind of step back a little bit and try to look at things in a broader perspective. But yeah, the Russian government, I mean, is certainly different than, looking at the UK or looking at, Germany as other large recipients of migrants. In the sense that Russia is authoritarian, of course, we all know that. And so the ways that politicians make their decisions and have to kind of market those decisions to the public is a little bit different. Also in Russia, we have what I would call the kind of the normalization of corruption, right? Corruption is kind of out there for everybody to see. Everybody knows that it happens. On some level, it's kind of normal operating procedures. So those things make Russia a little bit different. On the other hand, I think that looking at Russia and how the politics of immigration is managed, it really kind of demonstrates some principles that are pretty general in politics more, widely and outside of Russia. And that is first and foremost that migration is political, right? That it's about kind of people with different interests in the migration game, right? Some people want more migration, some people want less migration, some people want more illegal migration or informal migration because it's cheaper, because it's less regulated, because it has, some sort of beneficial criteria or, kind of qualities for employers. But there's different factions in the Russian government, just as in all other governments and society and economy that want different things. And the politicians still have to kind of manage these different kind of countervailing groups of people. So in Russia in particular, certainly the government knows that it needs migrants, and so it doesn't want to shut off the flow of migrants completely. You have kind of large portions of the population that don't want more migrants, right? Because they think that it takes away their jobs. Russians are traditionally, I think, very afraid of unemployment. And this is something that both people and regional leaders are very sensitive to, right? So if unemployment rates start rising, not only are people going to start feeling nervous, but also regional governments are going to start feeling really nervous, like they need to start doing something to protect their local constituents, local societies from any sort of negatives that come from migration. So you certainly see these kind of different local level decision makers, federal level decision makers, making decisions for their own benefit. There's also the kind of perspective that different leaders, whether it's the Minister of Labor or the head of the Migration Service, they want to show that they're doing a good job, right? They've been given a task to do. They want to show that they're doing it competently. And in some ways, they kind of vie for control over different migration related areas. So we've seen some kind of interministerial struggles for control over migration in the Russian government, and kind of policy changes that have happened as a result of that really demonstrate that that different people at different levels of government decision making simply want control. They simply want decision-making power, because this is, it demonstrates that they're doing a good job. It also, as I tell in the book, it gives them access to the resources of corruption that are pretty, like I said, are pretty kind of ingrained in the Russian system. So if you can get control over a migration issue, whether, if you can get the Ministry of Labor to be in charge of issuing migration documents, well, this gives you more points of contact with migrants and potentially the opportunity to kind of build corruption schemes or extortion that benefits you not only personally, but more as an agency as well.
Can I ask you another question? So in terms of this, contact points, right, and the benefits for those who are in power, the recent changes in migration regime linked with the Eurasian Economic Union, and when citizens of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Belarus, do not need such permissions. So what do you think, how the system react on this?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because when that system came into place, it was seen as a sort of panacea, that this is going to change things fundamentally. It's going to give migrants from Kyrgyzstan especially, right, because this is the largest flow of those groups into Russia. It's going to give them a lot more rights. It's going to give them a lot more leverage. It's going to give them a more secure position in the labor market. And what we've seen is those things just aren't true. because the Kyrgyz migrants, in fact, have just kind of dropped out of the statistics. The government doesn't really, well, if they keep statistics on how many Kyrgyz labor migrants are working through the kind of procedures of the Eurasian Economic Union, they don't make it public, or they don't make it public in an aggregated sort of form. So we actually don't, there's so much that we don't know about that category of labor migrants in Russia. But what we do know from kind of our on the ground studies is that, Kyrgyz labor migrants are they're just supposed to have a labor contract with their employers, but most of them don't. Or if they do, they bought that contract, they purchased it, which is, kind of this ever evolving sort of, corruption sphere that's willing to kind of sell or make money off of migrants, regardless of how the laws actually change. So what we see is that Kyrgyz labor migrants often don't work with a labor contract, and this is an excuse by employers to just pay them less, right? If they don't have to pay taxes, if they don't have to work formally, this is actually beneficial for employers because they don't have to pay them as much to cover the kind of income taxes that they're being paid. So as much as the system tries to find solutions, I think, for migrants, and I think there is some element of really trying to find solutions for migrants. The system is flexible, and it always finds ways around those solutions, and that is a persistent kind of factor that we see in the Russian immigration system.
That's fascinating, all these transformations. And my last question is about, I cannot avoid it because you're American, and I'm sure you're following news on migration and Trump approach to migration. So what are similarities between Trump's and Putin approaches? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. And first I'll say that, like, as an American, like, it's kind of my job to criticize the president because this is our political culture. So, like, I wouldn't be a good American if I didn't criticize my president. But I mean, Trump is like, what is he doing with immigration? This is the most inflammatory immigration policy that we've seen coming from an American president in that I can remember. And in fact, it makes Putin seem like a very rational and almost humanitarian sort of character. So in fact, Trump is far more nationalistic and far more populist than Putin has ever been, I think. So when Putin talks about immigration, he very rarely uses inflammatory language. And occasionally he'll kind of use some security-oriented language, occasionally. And occasionally he'll, kind of speak in kind of more, I would say, broad kind of geopolitical terms rather than sort of ethno-nationalist types of terms. And he really, as far as I can tell, really doesn't use sort of discriminatory or scapegoating language. As not nearly as much as Trump does. So in this sense, like, Putin is a sort of classic technocrat about immigration, whereas Trump is a classic sort of populist character, really trying to whip up people's emotions about immigration. In fact, what we see with the Russian situation is that the sort of inflammatory language is in some ways devolved down to kind of lower level leaders, right? So sometimes you see governors, or you'll see party leaders, or, kind of local figures being much more kind of inflammatory and nationalist in their language than you will see Putin, or even Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, has learned also that to be inflammatory about migration is actually not very beneficial in this context, but to let kind of the lower underlings, or the, kind of lower level political figures take up this issue of kind of nationalist sorts of language is okay. It's safer, right? Whereas Trump is just really all over the place, and it's working for him in some ways. Unfortunately, it's really working because there's a large part of the American population that really wants to hear this, that really wants to crack down on immigration, wants to get illegal immigrants out of the country. And so this is in some ways a flip-flop in the sense that Trump is acting the authoritarian and acting the nationalist and acting the populist, where Putin is kind of being a little bit more, at least a little bit more guarded and a little bit